Welcome to the Transforming the Lives of Animals by Building Stronger Communities session at the Animal Law Conference. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kathy Hessler. I'm a clinical law professor and a director of the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our wonderful speakers. So we have Maad Abu Ghazala, who grew up in the Middle East and came to America to attend university. After receiving a law degree, he founded a Silicon Valley startup, creating software for patent attorneys. He sold that startup to Bloomberg Law in 2012 and used the proceeds to found an animal sanctuary called Daily Hugs in his home country of Palestine. The sanctuary is currently home to 15 rescued donkeys and 50 rescued dogs. We also have with us Akeisha Townsend-Eaton, who has over a decade of animal law experience and is currently a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she works to implement the goals and strategic objectives of the nation's largest pro bono network for animal protection. Outside of work, Akeisha has a passion for community service and advocacy and is an AmeriCorps alumni. She's currently active in the grassroots community, as well as the legal redress, environmental justice, and economic development committees of her local NAACP chapter. And we have Hugo Echeverria, an attorney at law and doctor of jurisprudence granted by the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Quito, Ecuador. Hugo has worked in environmental law since 2001 with an emphasis on biodiversity conservation, the environmental rule of law, and the rights of nature, areas which he practices as an attorney and a consultant. And we have Shauna Gray, who has a master's prepared clinical social worker, and she and her husband, Joran, have been vegan for over 21 years and have 3 vegan children. They are animal rescuers and currently reside with 3 rats, 2 cats, and 3 dogs. Shauna is Indigenous, a member of the Segakin, Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation in Treaty 4 territory. As an activist, Shauna is involved in social justice, animal liberation, and environmental justice work. She's currently an organizer for Regina Pig Save, Animal Save Movement Saskatoon, and Saskatchewan Climate Save. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us today. We're very much looking forward to the conversation, and we'd like to begin our discussion. And what we'd like to do is start with a question of how does having a strong community lead to protecting animals? So who would like to start us off?
Well, if you don't mind, I guess I could pitch in right here. So I'm probably living, or my sanctuary is in an extreme situation where we actually don't have any laws that protect animals. We have 0. This is basically a nation under military occupation in Palestine. And the Israeli government doesn't really care about what happens in the West Bank, which is where my sanctuary is. So there's really no checks and balances on what people do when it comes to the animals. So all that's really left is the society to self-govern. And it's very obvious in the street what happens when you don't have laws. What you have is the most violent elements of the society. Let's take the children, let's say, that have psychological problems. Will start taking it out on the animals because they're weaker than they are. And so when they have frustrations, they take it out on the animals. So it's really the responsibility of the community to do the policing. I mean, this is an extreme example. I assume, in other countries, the police can't be everywhere. So at the end of the day, if there's something locally happening to the animals, at the end of the day, it's got to be the community that's got to sanction and police the individuals who are being violent or harming animals. And I think this is where leadership comes in. You need to have people in the community, within the community, not outside of the community, that show children how to properly respect all creatures, especially those that are weaker than yourself. And I don't want to take up too much time. I know we have lots of people, lots of speakers that have a lot to add, but I just want to give an example of how we have done it at my sanctuary that I created at Daily Hugs. is in the society there. It had before the sanctuary existed, which was started in 2012. Um, it was pretty rampant that children would torture animals in the street because nobody would stop them, and the people that do feel for the animals didn't really have the courage to speak up against these violent kids that were sort of ganging up. So when we created the sanctuary, our primary role was to, yes, A, rescue the animals that are in danger, their life was in danger, but B, it was just as important to bring in the children to empower them to see animals as loving creatures, because they'd been taught up until then that the dogs in the street, because most of the dogs in Palestine are street dogs, they're not in the house. They weren't dangerous. They weren't violent naturally. They weren't carrying diseases. So we'd bring in the children, and when they'd first see our animals, they would be scared. They'd be really frightened, and we'd bring in like 5 and 6 year old kids. We brought in like 50 or 60 at one time. So I took it upon myself to just take one child and say, "Hey, you want to come play with the animals?" And they'd initially be really scared. But I would just take them by my hand. Sometimes I'd pick them up and hold them in my arms, and we'd just go into a fenced-in area where all the dogs were. And all the dogs, I mean, you guys know how rescued dogs are. They're all so grateful to be alive. And so they love children. And it's just a matter of 5-10 minutes before you'd get a beautiful interaction between the animals and the kids, because kids and animals just go together. Puppies and dogs and 5-6 year old children just naturally get along. So they learned a new way to interact with these animals. And that's the hope, was that these kids would learn this new way of dealing with animals, and they would be the ones to police their friends or people they know who are trying to harm the animals.
Thank you. I think that's helpful, and it's wonderful to help people see that the animals and the kids are part of the same community, and as we're defining community. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would love to follow up on that. And I'm just so inspired by the work that you're doing, Maud, and your community. And I think that there's another lesson that I'm hearing there, and that those children that are working with you are eventually going to be the ones who are going to be our policymakers, right? And something that really caught my ear when you were speaking was that there is a reason why probably they're afraid of animals. Maybe there's been a story about them being dangerous or carrying diseases. And we know that, paying attention to those public health issues as well. So prevention of rabies through vaccination, neutering, spaying, so that people and animals can coexist. I think that that's, hopefully something that comes out of the work that you're doing as well, so that there can be good policies for coexistence. I have the fortune, I think, in my position of working with a lot of folks who they do want to do right by their animals. In the pro bono program, we serve folks that come to us with legal assistance requests from a wide variety of animal law issues that both impact the community at large and the animals that live within those communities. So I think if I were to take us all the way back, which it seems like a long time ago from where I'm sitting now, but it's actually not that long ago. But when we had Hurricane Katrina, we were able to see what happened when vulnerable communities were struck with disaster. So in the animal protection world, we paid particular attention to the plights of animals who, unfortunately, they couldn't be evacuated. And because of that, a lot of folks who were living with these animals wouldn't give them up, wouldn't leave, wouldn't evacuate, and they lost their lives as a result. So did the animals. And in getting those laws, the laws to address that passed, we as the animal protection movement really couldn't ignore the fact that those lives were lost. And I think that there is an opportunity to continue examining beyond, that particular situation where you had folks who couldn't evacuate for whatever reason and stayed behind with their animals, there's an opportunity to look at some of the factors that cause those vulnerabilities in the first place, such as the legacy of displacement, redlining, environmental justice issues, economic justice hurdles that plague so many other communities in society, in this society that we live in. And we also have a fresh chance, unfortunately, to look at that through the lens of COVID-19, which we've all lived through for the past 18 months. Each of us has been living in, I guess, a perpetual state of disaster, where we've also witnessed the scarcity of resources, as well as really more responsibility being placed directly on communities to resolve problems, and there are opportunities in that to create strength, resilience, and grassroots leadership. And we also cannot forget that the lives of animals are also intertwined with people and their problems as well. And for an example of how one community has, or actually for an example of how a few communities have dealt with this issue in the lens of animal protection, we had a federal eviction moratorium where, as many of you probably have seen in the news, there was really a pause on evicting folks because they had fallen behind in rent and couldn't find housing because it was a public health emergency, and all kinds of ripple effects could happen from an eviction. A few cities took the extra step of saying, well, people are living with companion animals as well. So you can't also you can't use companion animal ownership as a loophole for not having to comply with that eviction prohibition. So that's just one example of how it works, or how it has worked during this pandemic.
Thank you, Keisha. That's really helpful additional insight in thinking about how we frame community and how important it is to have strong communities. Thank you. Other thoughts?
So from my perspective, when I think about communities, I'm kind of thinking of two different communities that I'm a part of. So one being the animal liberation community, which is one that, as a rural family, we're not really surrounded by a lot of animal liberation people. So connecting with that community broadly, internationally, has been a place of connection for us. But also as an Indigenous person, living under the shadow of colonialism and the devastation that created in our communities, in our families, and that we're still kind of coming back from and healing from, and finding ways to get back to teachings that are really significant for us in the sense of our relationships with animals. A lot like what Maud was describing is some of what we're seeing in a lot of Indigenous communities, where dogs are kind of loose on the streets and not really sure. Kids don't really know how to care for them. And I've actually been part of programs a lot like what you were describing, Maud, too, where just trying to give those kids those empathy and compassion skills so that they can relate to these dogs who in our culture are seen as our kin. They're our relatives. They're part, like Kathy said, part of our communities. They're part of our broader relationship with the environment, and we honor their spirits and we're related to them. But somewhere along the line, so much of this got lost with all the trauma that we experienced. And it started to be really difficult for us to live our values in that sort of more holistic and meaningful way. So I think that those two communities that I just described, the animal liberation community and the Indigenous sort of community that I'm a part of, do have intersecting values in the sense of trying to help people to grow those compassion and empathy skills and kind of reconnect with that. And also I think that decolonization piece is such a huge part of how we can work together.
Really helpful. Thank you. Hugo.
The role of communities is so important and powerful that it can actually change the law. That is the case of Ecuador, for example. The topic of animal welfare or animal cruelty was included in the law in the past 5 years, and it is the outcome of nearly 2 decades of work promoted by civil society, either organized as NGOs or more broadly as what we call collectives. That means a group of individuals that get together to advance in a common cause. I am a lawyer, and I have addressed this particular phenomenon on how new values are pushed by society in order for legislators to address these emerging topics. And perhaps the most remarkable experience is the one behind the change in the legal frameworks regarding the relationship between human and non-human animals. To conclude this first part of the conversation, the main message is that the role of not only civil society but also individuals can be so powerful that has the effect of changing the law.
Thank you. I think what you have all said raises hope, I think, for people about ways forward, and also raises challenges, things that we need to be thinking about. So what you've described helps us understand that we have to be clear about what we mean by community when we say community, and even what our vision for animal protection is. And I think the conversation leads towards, where does this begin? Does it begin in the community? Does it begin at the law, in the law framework? So when you have sort of a post-colonial framework, or when we have different systems in which we're operating, and the different roles of civil society and of the legal system. So why don't we talk about that a little more directly now, and talk about the role of the law, and how the intersection of the work of civil society and of the legal structures plays out for you in your work and in your thoughts about how it should, or where we should go. Who'd like to lead us off on that part of the conversation?
I did want to comment on the fact that it's because we're missing the laws, right? So, Shauna was talking about a post-colonial existence. We're talking about a colonial existence. So we have a lot that we can learn from what's going on with Shauna. But the point I was going to make about the impact of law is it's very important. I wish we had some laws. I can tell you what it's like not to have laws. And when you don't have laws, and you go up to somebody and you say, "Please stop beating that donkey," they'll laugh at you, right? So even if there's no police, right? Let's say there's a law, but nobody enforces the law. It's still important, right? Because I want to be able to go to the donkey and say, "Hey, you can't beat that donkey. There's laws against what you're doing." It's a sanction of the society. The law represents what the value system of the society is. And again, it doesn't matter that the police is there to enforce it or not. It's the values of the society that the society has agreed to. And I can just tell you what it's like when we don't have it. If you're a 7, 8-year-old child and you're trying to confront a bully who's beating up a dog or a puppy, they're going to laugh at you, right? And you have nothing to say. It's like, who are you? Who are you to tell me not to beat up this dog? So I can't tell you what it's like to have these laws. I can tell you what it's like not to have these laws. And it's very difficult to have credibility, to tell people to stop doing things when you have nothing but your own voice to back it up. You don't have the sanction of society. You don't have the sanction of the law, the government, nothing. And people are going to laugh at you. So I really do encourage, the stronger the laws, the better, because they, like I said, they represent the will of the people, hopefully, in a democratic society. And when you don't have it, it's just really difficult.
Thank you, Mad. Yeah, Ugo.
Laws adapt to new values provided by society. So to answer the question, society or the community comes first. They are the ones putting these issues on the table, on the agenda, and then the state, politicians, legislators take it on. That is the case of laws on animal welfare. That is the case in Ecuador. 2014, the concept was included in the law. Animals, much like anywhere else, are legally classified as objects. However, in 2014, the concept of animal welfare was included, setting legal obligations to people acting as holders or owners of animals, something we did not have before. So right now, animal welfare is a legal objective standard. And based upon this legal recognition, back in 2017, Ecuador began debating about punishing animal cruelty in the hands of criminal law. And after 2 years of debate, there is a new law that passed at the end of 2019 that classifies animal cruelty as a crime. If I'm not mistaken, similarly as in the US as a felony. And this is the direct result of the work of civil society that was basically demanded legislators to include this topic in a bigger package of reforms on criminal law. So the lesson one learned from these experiences is that community comes first, law comes after, as the result of the active role of community. And that is basically the same phenomenon that happens in any social phenomenon. The law ends up adapting to the new social requirements. And the case of Ecuador, again, is a clear example of that.
Thank you. And it's useful to have a recent and hopeful example of moving forward to increase the protections for animals. Thank you.
Yeah. To date, just before somebody else continues, to date, the message has been so powerful that people, not the state, not the enforcement authorities, but people are bringing cases to courts on this matter because they have taken this, they have embraced the issue so powerful and so seriously that they themselves are going to court on behalf of animals.
That is very powerful as an example. Yeah. Additional thoughts from Shana or Keisha?
Yeah, following up on Maud and Ugo's contribution there, I think that there is something to be said about people feeling empowered to voice those concerns about their animals and having an avenue to have those issues addressed appropriately through the legal system, through the regulatory system, the administrative system, and other avenues as well. I was just recollecting, so I work with some young people as well, mentoring them on the weekends in law and government. And we really tried to emphasize just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the separation of powers and the functions of government, but to so many of these young children, and many of them live in neighborhoods under the poverty line, and it came to my awareness that many of them never really saw the government as necessarily serving them in the capacity that they could be the change makers. Like, we're talking about the importance of voting. I think we all get that, get out the vote. But in terms of what happens after an election, how are you going to hold your lawmakers accountable when your animal's life or well-being is in jeopardy? Who are you going to call? Are you going to feel safe calling for help when that happens? In order to address those issues, I mean, I think that the broader issue of of public safety has to be addressed as well. But I think that's something that we take for granted sometimes. When we are, we take for granted. I take for granted as an attorney, especially somebody knowing about the process of lawmaking. And challenging unjust situations. I have the tools and the resources to do that. What I would love to see is an ordinary citizen feeling just as empowered to make changes and to advocate for changes with their elected officials, and with those who have been put in the position to represent them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it helps us to think about the sort of feedback loop, if you will, right? From the people to the government to the enforcement aspects, arms of the government, and how all those relationships start, form, and continue to progress. Thank you. Shauna.
So, I come from a nation that had our own laws pre-contact, that were more aligned, I suppose, with natural laws and the relationships that we have with our animal relatives that we shared this country with. And I think that so much of that has been lost, but yet as part of this process of getting back to being self-determining peoples, we're finding ways to help animals also rejuvenate and also be self-determining peoples. One of the things that I think of when I think of this is a piece of work that was done by many different indigenous groups through Alberta and the United States called the Buffalo Treaty. And as you probably know, the buffalo were a really important part of indigenous traditional life and are considered our kin. In fact, we consider ourselves the buffalo and the buffalo are us. There's so much interconnectedness between us and the buffalo people. So this treaty basically serves as a document to help buffalo be able to live freely again and us to be able to reestablish our traditional relationship with them. So those kind of things are something that comes out of sort of this other form of law that already existed in this place before colonialism.
It's a very helpful framework, I think, to remind all of us that we are operating on multiple sort of paradigms, if you will, levels at the same time. And so here in the US, one of the things we lost by disrespecting and denigrating the indigenous community is some of this way of knowing and way of being. And so I think we sometimes, when we talk about the law, we think of it as this uniform, unitary thing that both exists in the same way for everyone, applies in the same way to everyone, makes the most, makes sense to everyone in the same way. And it just doesn't, right? So I think it's really helpful to think about the same way we talk about communities. Sometimes we know there are a lot of different communities, but sometimes we have to remind ourselves explicitly to think about those communities. And many of you have addressed different types of communities in your comments already. And I've thought a little bit about the through line of the young community, young people as a community, right? And they have different ways of knowing and different ways of experiencing both reality, their relationships with animals, and certainly their relationship to the law, whatever that looks like. And so for some, it's very alienating and very threatening. And some, they just don't have much experience with it. But interestingly, I think your comments have helped to illustrate that things that we think might be inherent in children, that they would love animals, isn't necessarily if that's not how they're raised, right? And so thinking about where these ideas and morals and values and goals come from, how they're transmitted, right? Whether it's through different traditions within different kinds of communities and or coming from an external source like the law. So sometimes I think we like it when we agree with the law. We don't mind so much if that external value is being imposed on a community because we think that's going to be helpful, right? It'll help the 5-year-old kid in Palestine speak up to a bully. It'll give him strength or her strength. But we don't like it if it's denigrating, for instance, the value of animals or the value of nature or the value of other people. And so we're in this really challenging sort of conversation that's an ongoing conversation about how we navigate these spaces. And so let's talk just a little bit more about how you all are doing that, how you're trying to bridge these gaps between different kinds of community and their understanding of law, and trying to utilize the protection of the law and to improve its ability to protect the things you're trying to work to achieve. I know that's sort of a large question, but and you've already alluded to some of this, but I think if there's more you would like to say about how you're walking that path, it would be great. Thoughts?
From my perspective, the target that I am looking for is actually the legal community, the people making decisions. And certainly this topic, animal rights, even rights of nature, are topics of, let's just say, that are not the most important topics right now for decision making. These are also new topics that not necessarily relate to traditional values. For example, as a lawyer, you are trained to think about animals from a property perspective, property rights perspective, and now we are addressing the issue of whether or not animals should be classified or regarded as something else. And of course, this creates a lot of not only resistance, but in general controversy among the legal community, my colleagues. So it is important to be, the type of work that I do is not engaged in debate or controversy, but rather on trying to let them see why this topic is important from a juridical perspective. Most importantly, from a constitutional law perspective, not from an indigenous perspective or from an animal rights perspective that seldom is familiar to them, but from a perspective where they feel comfortable and most likely they will be familiar. For example, if you go to a judge, I don't know, but anywhere, is somebody who is an expert on procedural law. If you go to a judge and you argue using new elements, such as the concept of sentient being, for example, you will probably the judge will probably won't understand you in the same level that it will understand you if you explain to that person that an animal could be seen of something more than a property rights perspective. So it's also a matter of how you build your argument, understanding that the other party, the one who listens to your argument, is not familiar with any of these things. So you have to be careful on how to, you also have to put yourself in the shoes of the other person. That's what I'm trying to say. And that, to me, has proven of great success, even greater than the ones who try to force the other to understand your own argument. See, do you see the difference? So that's basically what I can share with this panel at the moment.
It's a wonderful point to remind us that we need to be thinking about who our audience is when we're making arguments to make change, and to always, I think, be sensitive to the context in which they're thinking and operating. And I think both what you're suggesting is entirely appropriate strategically, right? To say, I'm not going to try to attack the underpinnings of the legal system, right? I'm going to use what we currently have, and then argue as successfully as I can to use what we have. And I understand other folks who might strategically say, well, I'm also going to help the legal system understand that when I say traditional, there's an older tradition, a pre-constitutional tradition. And then that's a different challenge, right? That takes on different strategic approaches. And so I think it's great when people are aware of what they're choosing to do, and then they're making choices to be as successful as possible within those goals and frameworks. Because I think both goals are appropriate goals. they're just different goals. And it is very difficult to do the work that we're doing and help people understand what colonialism is, and help people understand marginalized communities, and so this work needs to be done, and it's a question of who's well positioned to do it, who has the information, who's a good spokesperson, who's an appropriate spokesperson. All of those kinds of questions, I think, are what your conversation is helping us be sensitive to, and that's really, really helpful. So some additional thoughts along these lines. I see nodding heads. I'm sure there's more you would all like to say. Akisha, it looks like you're looking forward to
So
speaking.
many thoughts. I've got about 30 thoughts going on right now, and I'll probably just get to 2 of them. I think, in terms of, choosing the right spokesperson and going at it with the right angle, there's so much to be said for collaboration, in the pro bono program, and I'm just going to focus on we do a lot in the pro bono program, but I'm probably for this segment going to just emphasize our public assistance request. So we have a wonderful, large group of attorneys who have volunteered with us across the country, who have joined our volunteer attorney network, and their expertise is broad. So we might have, for example, we have civil rights attorneys. We have attorneys that work at legal aid during their day job. So they're working on fair housing issues. We have estate planning attorneys. We have attorneys who specialize in tort issues, and all of those things come together to address animal protection issues when they come about in unconventional ways. So sometimes it's really interesting to see how these pieces work together. And animal law is something that's always evolving, and we can even be surprised, even as practitioners, to see how these pieces integrate. So, for example, there is a story in the news about a possible unlawful search of a property that ended up with police shooting a dog. So that's something like that might come to our network, and a volunteer attorney would look at it from the perspective of an injustice has been done here for an animal, right? But when I leave work, and I'm on the legal redress committee for the NAACP, we might get that same request. And we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of, this person's constitutional rights were violated. We might, a grassroots group might not necessarily hone in on the animal part, even though that might be the most important aspect of the situation to the person who's complaining. So the more we can talk to each other and work together and educate each other about what we're doing, I think that will just propel gains, for all of our movements, as a collective society, to really push the needle there. So I am really excited for collaborating and working together to solve problems that we're looking at from different perspectives. Another thing that I'm really excited about locally is that we are focusing more on a community-driven approach to resolving animals, so that it doesn't even need to get to the legal system. For example, we have our animal control laws are housed and are enforced in a division called Neighborhood and Community Services. And that office is meant to really serve the community, be a resource, be a tool. There's lots of outreach. We're doing our trap, neuter, return program for cats, which is saving the lives of hundreds of cats every year through that program. We just revised our animal code to look at what a nuisance is. So we talk about community and, animals being seen as dangerous and threats possibly. Well, I've been able to be in this neighborhood. I've had connections to the neighborhood that I'm in almost all of my life. But if you have a situation where you're constantly moving neighborhoods and, there's a risk of displacement, you might not know those dogs. That dog that was growling next door, I know he's not a threat. They walk around the neighborhood. I know them. I know the neighbors, know their dogs. If I'm going to a new neighborhood, I might not have that sense of security. So just looking at things holistically, I think is really something that's important, especially now. So didn't mean to ramble on. And I've got probably many
No,
other thoughts, but just wanted to hit those.
I think it's really helpful, right, to be thinking about the collaboration between efforts just to make the world a better place, to reduce harm, to reduce violence, and to see these things, these efforts as connected is really important. It's something we have to remind ourselves, those in our community as well as others, that we're all on the same path, if you will, to making things better. And that's, I think, a really helpful way to be thinking about it. Yeah. Shauna, it looked like you had wanted to add something as well.
I think I was just nodding along. There's so much about what you just said, Akeisha, that just is so relevant to what we're doing here, just making those connections that maybe people aren't making themselves, in terms of the violence that's being experienced, the history of trauma for animals, for people, that we're all kind of sharing this experience, and that there's ways that we can work together to navigate that, to improve that for everyone, for animals and people. Sorry, I call both animals and non-human animals people. So, I mean, I call us both animals. We're all people. So I'm confusing myself right now, but.
And we're all animals. Yeah. it's helpful. Yeah. And
Yeah.
Ma, did you want to add anything as well?
Yeah, I'll throw in a couple of cents worth here. So I guess I forgot the original question. I sort of want to dovetail off of what I was hearing, though, in terms of cooperating and dealing with the authorities to accomplish what we want. And as lawyers, we're trained to just argue about everything, right? And when we deal with the municipality, it's really not about an argument. It's not about a moral argument or a religious argument. I could make religious arguments. A lot of what they do is based on religion. And so I can present them arguments why, their treatment of animals with respect is part of the religion. But that's really not how these decisions are being made at the municipal level. They've got complaints coming in. They hear about there's dogs in the street that are scaring their kids. So rather than just resorting to our initial knee-jerk reaction of, okay, well, you're completely wrong. Animals deserve better treatment. Look at, like we were saying, I think Ugo was saying, is put yourself in their shoes, and they got to solve these immediate problems. So rather than argue with them, we try to work with the municipality, saying, okay, well, you're hearing complaints about there's a pack of dogs in front of this school or something. Is how can we help you resolve that problem? What if we trap the dogs and move them to a different area where there aren't so many people? What if we bring them to our sanctuary? And the attitudes completely change. Instead of us being their enemy, that we're these noisy people that are giving us a bigger headache, we can be part of their solution. So my only point is, try not to judge the authorities, good or bad or whatever. Just recognize that they have issues every day they have to deal with. And maybe you can help them. If you help them, they're more likely to turn around and say, hey, we got this other problem. Maybe you guys can help us with that, and not try to resort to what we're trained to do, which is to give them legal and moral arguments why they have to do what you want them to do, and try to make their life a little better, a little easier.
I think that's really helpful. And I think it goes back to what Ugo was saying earlier about knowing your audience. And so you're going to have a different conversation with the municipal enforcement authority than you do with the judicial, right, authorities. And it's really good. You all have such a rounded and rich view of the work that you're doing. So to be able to have those conversations at different levels with different audiences and to see the connections. And it's so useful also to try and help the judicial authorities understand when they're enforcing or implementing or designing or analyzing a law, how it actually works on the ground, right, for the people at the municipal level, and how it works for the people who are trying to protect animals or suffering from the harm to the animals, and obviously the animals themselves. And having those dialogues, if you will, go back and forth, right, across those different levels of people who are involved and engaged in these situations is wonderful that you're all doing this, right? And that you're able to have those conversations appropriately with different communities and different elements of the, different sections, if you will, of these dialogues. It's wonderful. So yeah, thank you. There's more. I know that there's lots and lots more that we can say, but I want to give you each a chance to say either a little bit more about the work you're doing, or ways you think people can help with the work that you're doing. People who might be listening to this, things they might be able to do in their own communities and their own spaces, or things they can connect with you specifically in the work that you're doing. So either just describing a little bit more about the work you're doing, or ways in which people can help one way or another with the work you're doing. Who would like to get us going on that conversation?
Well, I'll be the first to pitch our resources and opportunities here. At ALDF, we have ways to get involved if you're an attorney or a paralegal, and I've shared the links for signing up for our network. We also have a remote advocates program called ROAR, so you can sign up for our advocacy alerts, updates as to what we're doing and how you can contribute in your own community. As a community advocate, I'm all about learning all of the issues in the local community and seeing how those connect to animal protection issues in the community, because they do. And I think that there's a lot of missed opportunities that we can definitely, look at, especially in the context that we're living in today. I mean, the CARES Act and other federal incentives also, in some contexts might be able to be used to serve animals in the community, especially to the extent that serving those animals will also help the larger community. So that's just, one example. And in doing that, I think, there was a question about, well, who is the community? Who are the animal protection advocates? And in my view, it's everybody. Everybody is part of our community. I feel like instead of looking at it from a kind of top-down perspective where you're delivering resources and you're defining issues that should be important for the community, if we're in the center, and the community is around us, and as we're talking about that feedback loop that you mentioned, Kathy, and looking at things from a grassroots perspective where there's community ownership and where the community serves as a change agent and drives that change. I think that's a helpful perspective. There's so many obstacles that have been overcome that our movement is not as necessarily even aware of, because it's been taken care of at the community level first. And I think that our victories, our shared victories, can only be stronger if we consider that broad community perspective.
Very helpful. Thank you. Shauna, would you like to go?
Sure. Yeah. Again, I feel like so much of what Akeisha just said is so true for how I'm thinking as well, that grassroots, building it from the ground up, especially when I'm thinking about that heavy colonial legacy of feeling so controlled and feeling like there was so much top down put on Indigenous people. I think just being able to draw from what is traditionally important to us and build from there something that's meaningful culturally for us is really important. And at the core of all of that, when you're looking at anything that we would be doing to build that kind of a framework, it would be about relationships and those interconnections and the interdependence that we have on everything that's here, the earth, the animals, each other. And I think that's at the core of whatever work that I always do, and I think that's what builds such a strong movement. And like Akeisha said, where everyone is part of advocating for animals.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Ugo?
Well, the message I would like to send is that the community, even individuals, people like you and me, have the power to make changes. And that's the message that I want to send. For us to keep confidence in what we do. It could be little, it could be big, but we were certainly we are all moving forward. So let's have faith in ourselves, in the power that small groups have towards change. I live in society that is in constant change. We are, for a fact, a country that 12 years ago recognized rights to nature herself. Okay, and right now, 12 years later, we are now designing what the law should, or how the law should address this new idea. See, so change is good, and people are the ones who are leading the change. That's the message I want to send from Ecuador, South America.
Thank you. And Maad.
Okay, so I think looking at the context of what we're living through right now, is the world seems to be extremely polarized. I know I've been in the States for a while, and it's just so prevalent that it's really easy to personalize things and to hate individuals. There's a lot of emotions that I think are not positive. And I think if we want a sustainable movement, we want sustainable change, I don't think you're going to get that from being motivated by hate. I think you're going to have to be, if you want to sustain something, the only way to sustain it is to be motivated fundamentally by love. And I don't mean to say that, especially as a Palestinian, I don't mean to say, well, we need to love Israel. I can hate an institution, which I do. I do hate colonialism and everything it stands for, but I do not hate individuals. I don't hate the individual children who are beating donkeys, or the person who sees a donkey as a labor animal. I can see the context of, I understand why this is happening. What you're doing is not healthy for society, yourself, the world, anything. But I also recognize that this individual is a function of what's happened through their life and the institutions that have influenced them. And I think I'd like to leave the message that it'll serve all of us to think of the world more in those terms, is that recognize the institutions that are causing these problems. And you're fully justified in despising these institutions, but don't transfer that to an individual, to a personality. Because in the long run, you're not going to achieve anything. If you're focusing all your energy on an individual or personality, so what? That personality disappears, your problem is still there. Focus on the institution, on changing institutions. And bottom line is, look in your soul and make sure that your motivation is pure, that you really, it's not that your hatred of these other people that's driving you. It's for your love of life that's driving you. And you'll find that you're not going to get burned out if that's your motivation. You're going to take on challenges. And you're going to overcome them because you're going to see the beauty of what's possible.
Thank you. Thank you all for your wise input, for your conversation today, for the work you're doing, for helping us think a little bit more concretely and explicitly about community, about how to be good members of community, about how to support one another in community, how to define community more broadly and more supportively, how to go forward, right? How to be seeing the connections between not just all of our work, but all of everyone's work. We want the world to be a better place. And there are some ways in which we can agree on what that might look like. There are things we can disagree about, but there's room for agreement, and we should pursue that and support that and work together towards that and see global community. I know it's sort of, silly sometimes to say that, but we can have these goals and we can try to work towards them. And so I will say personally that I'm glad to be a part of community that all of you are a part of. And I admire your work, and I thank you for taking time to talk with us about it today, to share it. I'll encourage anyone who's listening to this session, whenever they're listening, wherever they're listening, to support your work, to reach out to you to see what they can do to follow the goals and the suggestions that you've all made here today. So thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. For the people who are watching, thank you for joining us. And I hope you, the speakers, and you, the attendees, enjoy the rest of this conference. And I wish you all the best in all of your work. Thank you so much.